Hello, Crossroads. Welcome to the Senedd Sources podcast, where we take you inside Welsh politics. I am, as always, Ollie Cole, and also with me on the podcast, Joe Kiernan, former advisor to First Ministers Rhodri Morgan and Carwyn Jones. Before that, a journalist, and now at Cavendish Consulting. Hello, Joe.
Hiya, Ollie, from a thankfully sunny Cardiff after those days of rain and grey skies.
Well, you've sent the rain my way, so thanks for that. And also with us, Craig Lawton, who was a political advisor and candidate for the Welsh Conservatives, now working at Grasshopper Communications. Hello, Craig.
Hi, Ollie. Bad news for you, Joe. Just outside of Cardiff, it's just started raining.
Cheers. What a great way to start.
I can't wait. Yeah. Derek Brockway is going to sue this podcast if we carry on like this. So on the podcast today are the parties in the right place on energy and net zero, with a very special guest as well. We have a WhatsApp number along the way. You can send your comments and questions as you're listening to the podcast. Then we'll read them out in the next episode. We'll also use it when you come and join us for our live recordings in the future. That number you need, 0333 404 6507. Start your message with the word Senedd, or you can email us if you've got something a little bit longer to put down on paper with your questions and comments as well. The email address is hello@senedsources.com. Right, so first of all, Craig and Joe, it is by-election day. We are going to do a sort of more in-depth episode tomorrow on what the heck has happened as we get the results overnight. Obviously, at the moment, voting is open. We don't know anything apart from, people are hopefully going to the ballot box and casting some votes. We're going to turn our attention for this episode because, like I say, there's not a lot to talk about in terms of currently because people are currently voting to a policy area. And as promised at the outset, this podcast will go deep into policy areas, won't always be in hock to the headlines, and explore where the parties are, where voters are, and how that might play into things in the run-up to May's elections. And I'm going to be talking energy policy and polling with Cathy Owens, who is a director at Cavendish. Hello, Cathy.
Morning.
Lovely to have you with us. So Cathy brings with her a incredible tranche of polling, which has just been carried out on people's views on the energy transition, net zero. We hear a lot about, how fast net zero should go, how it's going to impact jobs across the country. And industrialisation and energy is sort of the story of Wales and its history, its people, its communities, and it's going to be the future of the country as well. So, Cathy, take us through, if you like, the sort of top lines, what you've been learning.
Sure. Okay. So we worked with YouGov and polled 1,000 people in Wales, and we were trying to think about how far the debate around energy in Wales has been polarised and whether the politicians are listening perhaps to some very loud voices on either end of the spectrum. And we were trying to gauge where do most people in Wales live in terms of energy generation. So Wales is a bit behind actually in terms of switch to large-scale renewables that it needs to. We have a real issue with our grid. It needs an upgrade. And we have slowed down our economy because it's harder to plug in large new developments. And of course, we're about to have to plug in the arc furnace at Port Talbot, which is going to require a huge amount of electricity. So the demands for energy and electricity in Wales are only going to increase and put a huge amount of requirements on new infrastructure. So we thought we definitely wanted to have a look at that. And we wanted to have a look at, the two outcomes that we've been talking about and potentially in a new government in May is either going to be some form of progressive sort of minority or coalition or some sort of right-wing blue team with Conservatives and Reform. And we were trying to look at, whether a Plaid Cymru policy or a Reform policy would have, is reflected in support. And what we've effectively found is that 70% of people in Wales are pretty happy with a step change in renewable energy. They're quite happy to see wind farms and turbines and solar power in their local area. And really quite significant numbers of people. And it's even more true, of course, in, let's say, the progressive parties, where you've got sort of 80 or 90% of people who intend to vote for either Labour or Plaid Cymru in the elections are really very supportive of more energy developments, in their local areas of all types, but onshore wind and solar, which often, has people standing outside them with placards, but it's actually quite a small number of people. So, even reform voters, even half of reform voters are quite happy to see more renewables in their local area, which is, we understand that's quite far away from where what reform are signalling in terms of renewable energy. But that said, when you look under the hood, actually it's Plaid Cymru that a little bit further away from their own supporters. So you've got a really significant number of supporters of Plaid Cymru that are very happy with tackling climate change and investing in onshore renewables. And yet Plaid Cymru, their policy is actually a little bit challenging because whilst they talk a really good game on climate change, their land use policy is quite conservative. So there's been a lot of work recently from the energy industry and Renewables UK saying, well, actually, we are going to have a look again at those policies if Plaid get into government, because it is going to have a bit of an impact on how we can invest in Wales. So you've got this slightly odd, it's a little bit like the horseshoe theory of politics, where people at the other ends of the spectrum are actually closer to each other than they are to the centre. And it's true here as well. So we have people in the energy debate on either end, people either, really actually don't believe in climate change, or people who just don't want any pylons and they should only be one pylon in each garden and, community owned and those sorts of things. And they do sort of meet in this horseshoe, which could potentially limit quite a lot of investment in Wales. And, large-scale renewables will just go elsewhere.
And well, let's bring everyone in on this, because that's really interesting, where people are, where the parties are in terms of talking the talk, and where the parties are in terms of where they might walk the walk. And Joe, in terms of communicating with voters, I think this is where parties find it a bit tricky, isn't it? Because it's very, very, very easy to talk to voters about something that is solid, that has happened, that is in their past, that they know exists and they know is around them already and is sort of part of their growing up, their life and their family life. It's a lot harder to talk to them about something nebulous that's in the future. So, some politicians and some parties decide, well, it's going to be much easier if we talk to people about, stuff they're already aware of, and just sort of say, well, let's not race into the future and all this sort of, sci-fi, whatever, we don't know what it is. Let's stick with what we know. But that's not necessarily the right way in politics to do it, and it's about leading the conversation or being sort of being in hock to the conversation along that way. So take us through how you might communicate that to the public, Joe, because it's a tricky one, isn't it?
It is tricky, and it goes back to something we were talking about last week, those long-term decisions that are needed, because one of the things that came out in the event that Cathy presented on the polling results is the long lead-in time that's needed for these kind of projects. And yet lots of our politicians are thinking in 4 or 5 year electoral cycles. And one of the other things that came out during that discussion was the fear of the unknown, as you say, that actually when you go back to talk to people after some of these projects have happened, their fears weren't borne out. But that's really hard if you're talking to the groups of protesters in Mid Wales or West Wales who are very angry, some of them, about the thought of new transmission lines cutting through the countryside. Cathy will go into it in a bit, but we also asked them about their views on pylons and undergrounding and some different variations on that. And I think in terms of the politicians, the thing that came over from the industry was just a bit more bravery needed, actually, that, there's a silent majority that aren't necessarily being listened to. And so Plaid, for example, have got themselves into this difficult position where there's a lot of antagonism to a large planned solar farm on Anglesey, for example, the pylons or undergrounding issue in West Wales, some of their key heartlands. So as Cathy says, on one hand, they're talking a good talk about wanting a future based on renewables, but they're not willing to actually say, we understand your concerns, but we're going to do it anyway. And that's a really tough gig when it comes to government next year and what they are or are not going to decide to do, and whether companies just think that Wales is closed for business.
And Craig, is in terms of that horseshoe that Cathy was talking about, the parties on the right, the Conservatives and Reform, are they just playing this politics game on easy mode, basically, by saying, well, we'll look to the next election, we won't have to deal with the just transition or anything like that, we can just hoover up the votes, be in power for as long as we can, and then see how we get on, because they've really sort of walked the conversation back on particularly net zero and climate change in recent months, haven't they?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting from the Conservatives' perspective, because in previous years, their position was always generally, let's find something different to say compared to all the other parties in Wales. That'll find us a hole somewhere where we can gain some support, gain some narrative. But obviously you have Reform, who have louder voices and much more ability to get that message across at the present, which means that actually that Conservative message is kind of being drowned out. But entirely, it's not dissimilar to the discussion we had the other week about the Senedd and Conservatives saying they want to get rid of the Senedd. It seems like the easiest, lowest common denominator when it comes to just getting some level of support and saying something different, which will engage a proportion of society which isn't normally engaged. But they aren't engaging with the Conservatives at the present, are they? But I think what's really interesting, and I think it's the point that's been touched on, is, and we found this with some of the conversations we've had with campaign groups and with MSs as well, is when you ask them to name projects that are coming forward or have happened that they're thinking about, everyone names a project which is currently being discussed, which is currently in the media, or which is currently going through planning. Nobody talks about the projects that have been completed and that are operational or that are waiting even to be connected to the grid. So as has been touched on already, it's very much what's in the mind right now, not what has come before and what is going to come in the future.
And Cathy, there's sort of been a fraying in the last couple of years of what we call a political consensus on net zero. There was quite a lot of, everyone was on board with that project. When Boris Johnson led the Tories, it was a sort of green Tory revolution. How much he actually did in terms of that in reality is perhaps a different question. David Cameron changed the Tory logo to a tree. That's how far they sort of came. And that seems to have fractured. But from what you're saying, in the voter base, it hasn't quite so much. And so, the reality is that politicians have to sort of start talking to voters a bit more sensibly again.
Yes, because we only found sort of 15% on either end of the spectrum who, have dug their heels in, and either on the right have said, no, climate change doesn't exist, so therefore we don't need to do anything about it. And yet, on that right, we've had the Conservatives this week and the Reform saying effectively, we will protect our pristine countryside from the invasion of these awful energy projects, but then, at the same time, what we found on the other side, which is a challenge as well, is for the first time we've seen a really serious party on the left saying we've also had enough of experts in this area. So we've heard that before from the parties on the right. Finger in the air, we've had enough of experts. We don't need to listen to what you're telling us about climate change or the need for an energy transition. We're sort of hearing that on the left as well, saying, because they're unwilling to listen to people talking about the cost of how much it will be to underground energy cables, for example, and the fact that we need quite a significant level of pylons and infrastructure to be able to plug these developments in if we're going to make any inroads at all. So, that is problematic if you have got serious policy platforms based on and not listening to either the 70% of the people in the middle or even the experts who sort of work in this area, because, that is what we're going to have in May. We're going to have the two scenarios are a government led by people on either end of that spectrum, and that is quite problematic for the industry generally, but it could potentially lead to further stagnation of the economy in Wales.
Just want to make a point as well, though, that I don't think the Labour government here in Wales has helped themselves particularly, because we had a huge amount of time where there was a huge blockage in the pipeline. Nothing was brought forward, and I must say, I think Julie James in her previous ministerial role did not help here. I'm going to paraphrase, but she essentially said we need renewables, but not at the expense of nature. That set a tone. We had nothing really brought forward for a significant period of time. That set an impression within politics and within the electorate that we didn't need this or it wasn't going to happen. But it also means that it's backloaded all of these things. They're all now being discussed 6 months out from an election, which means they are being hyper-politicised, which has not helped either.
I think that's a fair point. And I think that over the last 5 years, the planning system in Wales hasn't necessarily helped. I think in the last year or so, we've seen a different level of signalling from...
I think Aline Morgan and Rebecca Evans, they've definitely sped things up, yeah.
Yeah, both really, and they're very much trying to signal what is happening in London in terms of Miliband. So that's given some comfort to the industry. So when actually listening to the reality of the situation, I think that there's a nervousness across all business, because I do happen to sit on the CBI Council for Wales, and there really is a nervousness about change. Really what we're talking about here. The big picture is that Welsh politics has been relatively dull for the last 25 years. We've had the same party in government one way or another for the last 25 years, and they've built up quite a strong, engagement level with business. And it has been able to, that Labour government, if you're on 35 or 40%, you've been able to sort of reach over quite far left, but also reach over to the centre in terms of being business friendly. And business is a little bit worried. It's not just the energy industry, that on both sides of the spectrum, a little bit further out, they don't have those strong relationships, and that is going to have to change very rapidly in May, because I don't think the parties at either end of the spectrum are necessarily ready for what they're going to have to deal with on day one.
No, I think that's absolutely right. I don't think Labour have covered themselves in glory in this term. We've had no major projects consented. But one of the other things, Cathy, that I think we've learned through doing this polling is just that there needs to be a proper conversation with the public, because one of the other things we saw in the numbers was how cost of living concerns are really impacting people's judgments. And, we've been through a really tough time. There's so much evidence that people are struggling. They're not feeling they've got that spare cash in their pocket. And those conversations about whether you support climate change targets, whether you support the net zero targets, and even when it came to undergrounding versus pylons, you get different responses if you actually let people know the cost implications of these and environmental implications on the latter. And that conversation just isn't happening, is it?
There was some really interesting insights in there, I think, that we saw, which is the word net zero itself has become a bit tarnished. So we do need to go back to talking about climate change, attacking climate change. That said, it was younger people that were keen to talk about climate change as a principle in itself. As soon as you got to say, well, let's just say my and Joe's age, you started talking about how much it was going to cost. And as soon as they were more interested in well, I'm only interested in tackling climate change if it's not going to add anything to my bill. And the same as Joe was mentioning around undergrounding. So people are, not hugely supportive of pylons. But if you then say, but if we have to underground it, it's going to be, a lot more money. It's going to go on your bill. They'll say, well, no, I'll have the pylons, please. So, I think it's been quite interesting to see how we should shift that debate with the public. But it's still about reaching that 70%, that silent majority, that the people who are pretty sensible, generally listening to more than one point of view, but aren't ever turning up at the town hall. It's those people that we need to sort of help bring into that conversation, rather than just listening to the people at the either end of that extreme.
From a comms perspective as well, though, like when it comes to engaging with the public, one thing that everyone seems to kind of ignore and forget is that there isn't really a do nothing option. Everyone talks about, I'm not interested in doing something if it costs more. Not doing anything will result in bills going up as well, as there's an over-reliance on fossil fuels, on fuels from foreign countries. So actually doing nothing will lead to bills going up as well. So actually it's the fact that bills might not go up by as much, or bills might stay the same. I think one of the big things that we hear quite regularly on dissenting groups is people saying, well, why, if we've got more renewable energy than ever before, are our bills not going down? And the message is, if we didn't, your bills would be going up by more. And that's an angle I think that's needed to be looked at more as well.
And Craig, just what you were at Plaid Cymru conference, and it was interesting what Cathy was saying about this on that side of things. There's a conversation there where I'm probably quite controversial to them in this debate, but I quite like pylons and I quite like wind turbines. I think they look quite cool, and I don't mind a solar farm. But the truth is, there is a sort of a selection of voters who, at the minute they can see none of that infrastructure in front of them, and they think by putting nothing on it, that is protecting nature and the environment. Whereas the truth is, that's not really a long-term way of doing that, is it?
Yeah, and I think, when we talk about undergrounding, people don't realise that sometimes you need, I think one of the points that was brought up by an organisation at the Plaid Cymru conference is that if you underground, you're going to need, in places, 100-foot wide trenches dug. That's not good for the environment, surely. So, yeah, it's you also got to look at the fact that, if you look at some solar projects, even housing developments, some of these projects actually bring land back into use, improve the land in terms of flood risk. Obviously, that's investment. It's not just organizations and companies turning up and whacking something in a field. There's a lot of money and time that goes into planning these, and that all helps the environment as well. So I think that needs to be taken into consideration. For the record, I probably sit in the middle, those sort of 70%, not quite as far as you, Ollie. So I can just about see some wind turbines across the fields from us, and I'm ambivalent. I'm kind of like, don't really mind either way.
As Cathy said, though, Craig, we're old enough to remember, and we both worked in Welsh government in the past, and I remember actually being with the First Minister, going to one engagement, this was Rhodri Morgan, where protesters surrounded the ministerial car and started rocking it. It was really quite frightening because they were protesting about a wind farm in mid-Wales. And I just kind of think, I'm in the Ollie camp, and I think they're quite beautiful. Where my parents live in West Wales, very small scale. We have wind turbines across the field on another farm. I think one of the things, going back to the Plaid conference and this polling, is that the big concern is the large scale of some of these projects. And Plaid kind of want to sit on the fence and say, we support renewable projects, but we want small pylons. Or we want undergrounding, and we're in favour of solar, but we don't want the big solar farm that's just been consented and is now going to appeal on Ynys Môn. So I think there's a really tricky balance for them in particular going forward. I don't know if you agree with that, Cathy.
Yeah, do you know, what's interesting is to explain Plaid Cymru to people outside Wales, in a sense, is that they have their own horseshoe within Plaid Cymru. So if you moved everybody who votes Plaid Cymru over to the home counties and took away the Welsh nationalism and the Welsh language, you have, even within Plaid Cymru, people quite far on the left who literally said at Plaid conference, we don't need any more energy, and we don't want the English to steal our wind, and all those sorts of things. And then you have people within that you would ordinarily see on the right that say, we must keep these fields for the dairy farms, and we must do nothing to put the prices of grass up for farm. They've got everything within Plaid Cymru, and I think that is interesting because they haven't been in government for quite some time. They have played a role in terms of coalitions. Their manifestos are always really expansive, and I mean 40,000 words, and very few people have read every single one. So they're effectively 50% undeliverable because they're so enormous. So you just don't know which bits of it they are going to focus on. So I just think it's, there's a little bit of concern from the outside for people who haven't yet spent time with Plaid Cymru thinking, what is that sort of government going to look like? Because it is a little bit difficult if you're promising 47 things and you're not quite sure which one of those are the ones that are going to actually turn up in terms of the programme for government.
Yeah, if you look at people across the border as well, I had this conversation literally yesterday with somebody, and they said, yeah, but a Plaid Cymru government was still be moving forward with independence as a priority. And I was saying, well, actually, no, they've set out their stall that is not their focus, and they're going to be focusing on other things. But there is still this expectation, this assumption externally that is their main focus. So trying to explain that, I think, is key.
Now, I want to get onto something that all three of you have mentioned in terms of this, which is really going to define how politicians talk to that 70%, which is jobs and money and the cost of living. Remember to subscribe on your podcast app if you're enjoying what you're hearing, or you can watch us on YouTube as well. Search for Senedd Sources, where we upload full episodes for you to enjoy. WhatsApp us as you're listening with questions or comments, ideally using a voice note so we can play it out on next week's episode. That's 0333 404 6507 and start your message with the word Senedd, and we will be right back. This is the Senedd Sources podcast. Thanks for being with us today. It's Ollie, Craig, Joe, and we are joined by Cathy Owens from Cavendish as well. And we're talking about energy, and we've gone through sort of the infrastructure, what the energy might look like, and why it's good to go green in those circumstances. But let's talk about that 70% you talked about in the polling earlier, Cathy, because selling it to them, connecting to them, is going to involve more than just sort of saying, hey, we all love renewables, right? You know, you've actually got to connect with them on issues that voters actually take to the ballot box. And I think one of the problems with renewables and energy is when you start talking about it, it's very, very important if you ask people directly, what do you think about net zero, and what do you think about climate change, and what do you think about energy? But in terms of if you were to ask people, you know, what's top of your mind when you go to the ballot box, it's not there, right? So it's sort of, it's highly important, but low on salience. Something, though, that is always high on people's minds is how much their energy bills are, how much they're taking home in their wage packet, how secure their job is. And in part, that polling sort of tells you that politicians really need to start engaging in that conversation and leading that conversation a lot more, doesn't it?
Yeah, and actually, I was genuinely surprised by the overall figure for how salient and important people saw climate change, because only 50% of people, thought that the Welsh government should be doing more to tackle climate change, which I thought that was going to be much higher, and that fell off quite quickly when you said it, and it's going to cost you money. So it is, it's one of those quite nebulous and complicated things. It's certainly not going to be why people vote for certain parties, and yet every single day there is going to have to be really significant conversations about major investments in Wales. Otherwise, we are not going to be able to, keep our factories open and our jobs. And, if people knew how much electricity that arc furnace in Port Talbot is going to take, it's going to be astonishing. And, we need a government that's going to back the number of developments and the type of developments that is going to be able to deliver that. So it's going to be incredibly important, and yet it is clearly something that parties really don't want to talk about anyway, except for in a sort of quite protectionist way around those, in order to capture those last bits of those loud voices. It is going to be a real challenge.
Isn't there a case, though, that, as Ollie says, just changing that narrative to one of jobs and growth, because that came over really strongly from the sector panellists, didn't it? And that even the conversations they've had with reform representatives in Wales in the lead up to next May, it's been quite negative towards new projects. But when you said, actually, this is what it can mean in terms of growth, this was what it can mean in terms of jobs, they suddenly, that kind of fierce antipathy kind of started melting away. And Jess Hooper from Renewables UK Cymru had a really interesting figure that there are £37 billion worth of projects in the offing. It's the thing that really stuck with me after the panel discussion. And, covering up to 60%, I think it was, of the Welsh economy. These are massive amounts. And I think that the tone we've seen from Labour more recently, and particularly from Ed Miliband, he's talking about it a lot in the last few days, but over the conference period too, that's been firmly framed in terms of jobs and growth, and that obviously impacts on cost of living, etc., going forward. So I think there are changes to the narrative needed.
It was interesting because I think even going back to Welsh Labour conference in Llandudno, we were starting to see a change then. Maybe not on the stage, but in the one-to-one conversations with special advisors and ministers, the discussion straight away was about jobs about investment. And I wonder whether, this might sound a bit negative, but I wonder whether Labour and the Welsh government have been talking about climate change and net zero, and actually no one was really listening, because as we said before, no one's really paid attention before. Now they've realised they need to shift, and it's a pretty big shift pretty quickly.
And there was a lot of, or at least I picked up at Wales Night in Liverpool at Labour conference. I've found a lot of people are really interested and excited about renewables and the future and the possibilities that lie ahead, but really, really frustrated that the UK government, Ed Miliband in particular, continues to talk about renewables jobs in the future and never quite mentions what happens to my job now and where does it go and how do I get from job A to job B and who's going to train me, who's going to skill me, and who's going to make sure that my money for my family doesn't run out. You know, I mean, I'm from Pembrokeshire, and you know, you've got 1,000 jobs at refineries. It used to be far more, obviously, but there. And you've got 20% of the UK's energy coming through the port of Milford Haven. You've got 15% of GDP is created from those refinery jobs. And none of the renewable stuff is going to come online until 2030. Now, that's only 5 years in advance, but people have already seen those refineries close down around them. People have already seen those jobs go away. And it's not young people who are sat there now who are willing to move to another place for a job once they've got the new skills from the local college or university. It's people who've got families there already on good jobs, wondering, why am I, you know, what's going to happen to you? Why am I going to have to head out of where I've lived, brought up my family to do that? And that is something that politics on this hasn't quite addressed. And at the moment, the one party that is addressing it is Reform UK, and they're not addressing it necessarily in a future-facing way, but they are addressing it, and so it's connecting with people. And unless other parties, Cathy, start catching up and having that conversation, they're only ever going to be running behind saying, oh, no, please don't do this, aren't they?
I think that there's a danger as well of over-promising. Because these things take so much time. So if you're in Pembrokeshire, you will have been told that there's going to be thousands of jobs coming along with the offshore floating wind project. And that, I'm afraid that just isn't going to be the case. You know, there's going to be some maintenance jobs and other things in Wales, but, you know, they are going to be floating these very large turbines from other ports out into the sea. So, and anyway, those projects are years and years and years away. What could be done a lot more quickly is that step change in renewables onshore. And yet that is where quite a significant proportion of the Senedd that's going to be elected in May, they're going to be pretty against it. So, you know, if you're a large-scale developer, you know, you're going to look elsewhere. And I think it's just a little bit too early for the Senedd elections, isn't it? So Ed Miliband, Keir Starmer talking about national renewal, and, you know, planning their election in, you know, 4 years away from now. That's all well and good. But this election is just coming a few years too early for anyone to see any benefits in this policy shift.
I think what's interesting in touching on what you just said there, Cathy, as well, is there's this assumption, expectation from politicians and the public that it's offshore or onshore. And we see from campaign groups all the time saying, why do we need these proposals in our area? Why don't we have them all out at sea? And actually, you need a suite of both. It's not either or, it's both. And that hasn't really been communicated either, I think, has it?
That's one of the interesting things from the poll, though, Craig, is that actually we expected there to be a bigger differential between onshore and offshore. And it just wasn't there.
Yeah.
It was slightly smaller for onshore, but nowhere near what you would expect.
The actual the area where people really weren't that supportive, as you wouldn't be surprised, was nuclear. Ironically, I think we're just about to get another nuclear announcement in Wales, that we're probably going to get something in Wilver. And given Plaid Cymru's slightly odd relationship with the policy on nuclear, they're actually quite keen. They feel, I think, that they have, I think the leader of the council described it to me as social licence to develop new nuclear in Wilver on Anglesey. Ironically, given that that the Senedd member there, Rhonab Iorwerth, who's quite possibly going to be First Minister, is actually fighting the solar renewables on the island. But they are quite happy with nuclear, which is the polar opposite of what their supporters would like them to do, and we've got the data to show it.
It's interesting though, because it goes back to what Ollie said, doesn't it, about those well-paid jobs, because that nuclear does tend to have well-paid, solid jobs for a long period of time, unlike your floating offshore wind, etc., where it ends up being maintenance.
It's weird because part of this opposition to some things seems to be based on the fact that it feels new and uncertain. And for a lot of people, nuclear, and I would put hydrogen in this area as well, they still think it's untested and it's new and it's not used. And actually, there is infrastructure in this country. There is infrastructure across the world. It's tried and it is tested. And again, I think there's a piece of work to be done there to try and help people to understand the contribution that these pieces of infrastructure and these energy forms are already having, and the fact that they aren't new, they aren't untested. I think there's always an assumption that these things are going to go wrong, and actually there are great examples where they definitely are not, and they are really contributing across the world.
And in that vein, energy and infrastructure, like I was saying earlier, is sort of a really core part of Welsh life and Welsh history, Cathy. And, it has been dogged by politicians, people think, sticking their nose in where they're not wanted. We were quite happy here with what we were doing, and politicians stuck their nose in, or stuff going wrong, disasters, terrible stories of tragedy. And so it's a really emotive conversation to have with people. And so that's why it's odd, I always think, that politicians don't have it as much.
Yeah, and there's two elements to that story. There's the element of the fact that a lot of this infrastructure is going to end up sort of reindustrializing those areas that we've just deindustrialized. And the other element of that is the sort of slightly nationalist take on it, which is the extractive bit of it. It's we're having to industrialise again in order to export our electricity to England. And I think that is playing, both of those things are playing within the Plaid Cymru sort of ambit. That is true across the parties as well. But it's just an added element that makes everything slightly more difficult in Wales all over again.
Well, Cathy, it has been amazing having you with us, and so nice to have a proper sort of conversation. Maybe if more politicians had this conversation, we'd be a little bit further along on the actual policy point. But like you said, Cathy, it'd be interesting how this May's elections, it's probably going to be a political football, but not a sort of long-term conversation. But very soon that's going to tip over into, oh no, we actually need to think about the future of Wales and its economy. So absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much, Cathy. And also thank you, I'm sure you don't mind me letting listeners know this, thank you for coming with a little bit of a hangover and talking about energy policy, because a lot of people would not do
Ollie.
that.
Quite right. I still have a few wine fumes left over from quite a busy Westminster dinner, but I think that, that makes it all the more interesting. You never know what I'm going to say, Ollie.
Excellent. Well, listen, thank you very, very much. And thank you for bringing that pony to us as well. It is absolutely fascinating. And one of those big conversations that's going to be happening in Welsh politics over the next few months. And thanks, as always, to Joe, and thanks, as always, to Craig. And we are going to be back with each other a lot sooner than you might imagine. We're going to be back with each other tomorrow because we have that by-election in Caerphilly. It's happening as I speak. And by tomorrow, we will know the state of play. All of the journalists will have been thrown out of whatever sort of random council building they've all been thrown into. There'll be speeches galore, and we will set the scene for you. We'll try and work out what happened and what it means for the future of Welsh politics. If you want to hear that and get it the moment it drops into the feed, press subscribe on your podcast app. You can find us to watch on YouTube as well, and we'll drop into your feeds every week and tomorrow with the latest on Welsh politics and policy making. You will not miss a thing. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll talk with you again tomorrow.